Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We are just a smidge behind today, so we're going to go ahead and skip our recap for now and jump straight into our guest introduction, and then we'll recap at the end. So, for today, we have a lovely guest, the one, the only, Alexandra Mannerings, and she is here to kind of continue our conversation we had last week with her on episode 84, which was all about the scientific process, and we talked about from the beginning, like, how does it start from the idea? How does it start all the way to turning into science, into a report, into something that goes out into the world and would end up being a headline that you at home might see? So we talked through that process from hypothesis and data and report to the peer review process as well. But we couldn't help but feel like we needed to kind of talk a little bit more about some of the other things that are involved in science, which is like, what even makes science happen in the first place? And what are some of the issues that can come from trying to do science? Where there are humans involved, there are bound to be issues. So with this, today we'll talk a little bit about, you hear these words, significance, statistical significance, maybe you've heard, or maybe you've seen in a headline, of course, the classic things like, oh, don't do this, or you'll die, or it's 5 times more likely to happen, or things like that. And then, of course, there's things about replication, like how often are you going to be able to, just because one study found something, are you going to be able to do that again? Like, is that something you can now say, oh, well, we saw it here, so now it's true for everyone everywhere? So there's just a couple of little tidbits of the things that we'll be talking about. But without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest. Good morning. Good morning, Alexandra. How are you? Oh, wait, hold on. Are your mic levels moving? Say something again. It says you've muted yourself, so check that one for me. Look on the web interface. Why don't you try restarting your browser, and we'll come right back to you. Oh, no worries at all. So as Alexandra figures that out, this leaves a great time for our recap from yesterday. So yesterday we had a conversation with Libby Corno. It was the second half of our WHAM conversation. So we made up the acronym WHAM, and basically what happened with WHAM is there's WHAM, wholesomeness, hospitality, art, and munchies. Excuse me. And so yesterday was the second half of that, which was art and munchies. And so with her and Ryder yesterday, we talked about those, and Libby was telling us about what those meant to her. Like, why does she like food in the first place? And then much less, why did she decide that it should be such a big part of her life that she wants to try and have that be her business, and not try and have it be her business. It is her business, and she wants to bring art and munchies. I mean, we use munchie as a fun term, but some of the food she makes is, kind of munchier, snackier type of things, but other things are, full meals and things like that. So why are those things important to her, and why she did those things? And we talked a little bit about the design process as well, and Libby was sharing a piece of commissioned art with us, and she's like, hey, or, well, I was doing this for this client, and they're like, oh, maybe you can change these couple things. And so we had a little bit of discussion of like, all right, well, how do you know when enough is enough? And maybe this thing is good by itself, but maybe it needs to, maybe if it was tweaked, it could be a little bit better. Maybe you could even do multiple versions of it and create a collection. And of course, we went into a lot more about that. And we had a little bit of a couple of banter around sleep, how much sleep we should get in a night. But right now, our guest has come back, so let's go ahead and jump back over to Alexandra. Good morning again.
All right, trying again.
Hey!
Does that work?
We did it. Yes, it did. Welcome back.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries at all.
I always test it in the green room and it was working. I don't know what's going on.
Well, I blame science,
Fair enough.
How was your week?
It was very good, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, always good.
Well,
I'm excited to be able to continue our discussion about the scientific method. I know other people may not get quite as excited about how powerful and wonderful it is, but certainly floats my boat.
Yeah, for sure. And me too. But I guess let's start off with that. Like, why should the average person who cares nothing about science, is like, I don't want to be an engineer, I don't want to be a scientist, I'm going to leave all that to them. Like, right. Why should somebody care?
I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that science impacts almost every aspect of our lives. And so if you aren't at least passingly familiar with how that scientific process works, you're going to really be at the whim of what sort of comes down to you, rather than being an active participant, or at least a critical thinker about the things that are being talked about, the policies that are getting made, about the debates and the arguments that are happening. And I think that being comfortable just with how science is done, one, will make you more confident when things come out, right? And a change is made, a new vaccine shows up. When these things happen, if you understand how they came to be, you'll be more comfortable looking at it and say, yes, I understand what happened, and I can either feel confident about this, or, I have some questions based on how this was actually done, the work that surrounded it, and maybe places where I can be more astutely skeptical, right? Not just, I'm going to be skeptical of the whole thing because I don't understand it, but no, I'm going to ask some pointed questions. And then if those questions can be answered comfortably, then I'll be okay, rather than just being generically skeptical of science because you don't necessarily understand how it happened, because then there's nothing that can make you feel comfortable with it until you understand it and can have, sort of more directed questions that are answered.
Yeah, I would say, I guess one of the things that I want to try and help achieve for people as we talk about this, not just today and not just last week about the scientific process, but as we're helping people to learn more about data and how it works and what you can use with it, and statistics and probability, and even those things can get really complicated really fast and really hard to process, that type of stuff. They can really help you understand why the world is the way it is, and why things happen to you, and why things happen to others, and what are those things have some sort of real specific meaning behind them, and which ones are just, some people would call it bad luck, but it's just statistics. I mean, that's all luck is, right? And people who think bad things happen to them all the time think that they have bad luck. Yeah. But at least scientifically speaking, I don't know if luck's even a thing, but go ahead.
I mean, luck is basically saying, what was the outcome of a statistical probability, right? And did it come down the way that you wanted, in which case you were lucky? Or did it come down the way you didn't want, in which case you were unlucky, right? So luck is sort of an assigning a value to a probabilistic outcome, a chance of something happening. And then we say that we want one of the outcomes and we don't want one of the other outcomes. And therefore that's luck.
Right. And so, by talking about these things and talking a little bit about how they work and the process and some of the things that can go wrong with it, we're helping you guys to know a little bit about how science works, but also it's kind of helping you think about, okay, well, if something is going out there into the world, what all needed to happen before it went out there into the world, and what is that thing trying to do? What is that thing trying to achieve, right? There's a couple of questions that are great to ask anytime you see a headline or read an article or something like that, and we'll cover some of these today, but one is, why does this exist? Who is funding this? And then who is benefiting from this? Those are a couple of questions that can help ground us as we're starting to work through those things. But yeah, I would
add one question to this. So I've been learning a lot about the construct of data equity and about how many of the questions that we ask in science, we sometimes ask unconsciously, and about bringing to the light the frameworks that we use to drive our scientific process. Because as we talked about, science is unbiased. Scientists will always be biased because we're human, and it's not possible to exist as a human and not be biased, because otherwise you wouldn't function in the world. We talked a little bit about that with like confirmation bias and some of the other mechanisms that we have for managing the world. We have them because if you had to actually treat every single incoming piece of information as completely unique and unconnected to anything else, you couldn't do anything. So we have to make these generalizations in order to actually function, but sometimes those generalizations have a downside. And so what data equity is all about is this idea of lifting up our generalizations and our assumptions just into the light. Not saying it's bad to have them, because we all have to have them, but can we be transparent about the ones that we have? And so I would add a question to your list, which I think was a very good list, which is, what is the framework or the lens that the group or the individual putting new information forward is using? What are their stated beliefs, or what do we know about how they see the world? If they're a huge conservation proponent, right? They really, really support conservation, and they put out all this research that supports why conservation is so important, then you would probably look at it and be like, okay, I get that. And you are going to be more inclined to find evidence that supports conservation is good than you are going to necessarily be to find something that says conservation might be bad. And similarly, if you're a logging company and you put out a whole bunch of stuff that says conservation is bad, it's like, well, that's the lens that you're working under. So again, just being aware of those lenses and what we're inclined to find and support is also important.
And we talk about lenses all the time on this show, and we say, hey, like, it depends on how you're looking at that thing and what you're going for, what you're trying to get out of it, things like that. But one thing that I don't know we've talked about as much on this show is think about the lens that whatever the thing is being projected through. And so that's what it's saying, like, okay, a scientific institution or a university or a company is putting out something, right? The lens, another way to think of it too, can be a filter as well, because there's all this information, there's all this data, and then it's going through that lens, through that filter before it goes out into the public. And then guess what? It's going through other lenses and filters probably before it even gets to you, right? And so part of this whole process is understanding, like, first recognize that, like, before something gets to you, it started at the source, and it's kind of like the telephone game, right? Except the telephone game, but with not everyone has the right intent, right? I mean, a lot of times in the telephone game, sometimes there's people who just trying to mess it up, but sometimes people are just literally trying to get the message across. Right. Well, in life, people have all sorts of their own things they're trying to add and tweak and trying to make it so they can benefit the most and things like that. So last thing on the why this is important and why the layperson should care, then we'll get into the actual meat of it. But one of the other things I'm trying to do and hope we can accomplish through this series is talking about how you shouldn't distrust science as an entire institution, right? Which is some of the dialogue we hear a lot. And of course, there are certain groups that have a lot more justification as to why they shouldn't trust the man or whatever, or science or things like that. But we really want to help step people back from that ledge and say, hey, look,
Yeah.
no, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like,
Right.
certainly there are people who are doing science wrong and using the process and things like that for the wrong reasons, just like there are in business and religion and every area of life, right? So that's go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's why understanding the scientific process is so important, because there are institutions where there are drivers or incentives baked into how that institution or that process is designed that makes it more likely for it to go wrong. So totalitarian regimes have yet to really show a good outcome, because as you concentrate power into a single entity, the fewer checks that you have on that entity, the more likely they are to be like, well, I'm going to do whatever I want. Like, that just kind of is what seems to happen. And so you could argue that that institution itself is flawed. It's not just that humans are flawed, but there is a flaw in concentrating power into a single person. But with science, what we find is that the institution itself is more encouraging of self-correction.
Yes.
So even when individual scientists or even groups of scientists, so even if you have like an institution of scientists or a body of scientists that have really gone off the rails, because of the mechanisms of science, because of the way that science works, you're more likely to then correct it or empower others to go, I don't think that's right. Or to have information come to light that can challenge an incorrect assessment, an incorrect policy. And so that's what makes science so powerful, is even with the fallibilities of us as humans, the construct of science itself helps us fix them. And so that to me is what's so powerful and so important to understand, is that yes, we make mistakes, and some of them are much more egregious than others. And sometimes there are things held up as science where you're like the whole eugenics movement, that was like one colossal F up, right? And it was cased as science, right? It was cloaked in this idea of science, but it really wasn't. And it was driven by some incredibly flawed beliefs that scientists held. But again, science itself was able to produce information that showed how flawed eugenics was. And so just because eugenics could have coexisted in the framework of science does not make all of science wrong and bad.
Yeah, sometimes the entire institutions need peer review that over time will end up get fleshed out, right? But it doesn't, just because you have a good structure and a good system doesn't mean that bad apples still can't make their way through sometimes. And of course, since humans are involved, and actually even more importantly, when you have powerful countries, governments, large businesses, things like that, of course, there's going to be more likely that there's going to be issues, right? So you've got me convinced, that's for sure. Not that I really needed convincing, but let's go ahead and jump into some of the specifics. Oh, I wanted to mention, because we shared it in the chat, as we were talking about lenses and filters and things like that, it made me think of that video about autism the other day that I think I shared on a previous episode, a Mark Rober video where he talked about autism and about all of the stuff coming from everywhere and being overloaded with their senses. And so it's kind of similar. Take that idea, but think about it through data and science. And it's like, all right, we got to filter out some of the things, figure out what's good, and focus on just that. So when it comes to what can go wrong with science, one of the first things that we should talk about is what is this thing about significance? What does that term mean?
Yes, so this is a critical thing, because if you read any kind of like press release or a summary of a study, you'll almost always see something that says the findings were significant, or we showed significant improvement in, or this group was significantly different than. And you'll notice it's always the same word, significant. And that's because while in English, significant can mean meaningful or, impactful, significant in science means that it was statistically distinct enough that we think it's more likely okay, sorry, hang on.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
Well, I think it should start another one, Leo. Their show ended, so they're like, oh no, we need another one.
Oh, it happens. It happens.
Right? But so statistic significance basically means that we do some kind of test to show that the finding is more likely than not due to some effect, or some real underlying difference rather than just random chance. So what does all of that mean? It means that when you're looking at something, let's say, you're comparing two groups and you want to see if Gatorade makes you better at sports. So you're going to give one group Gatorade and one group not Gatorade. And we talked about this with the bunnies, right? When we were doing a controlled experiment with our bunnies.
Yeah, floppy ears.
Right? Well, usually in any of these systems, there's a lot of other things going on, right? If we talk about sports, we're not all identical in how we do sports, right? Some days we're feeling it, some days we're not. Some of us are way better athletes than others. There's like so many things that are happening in there. So we talked about, you can randomly assign to a group to try to control for some of those factors, but there's still just going to be natural variation, natural differences in how we accomplish something. So whether it's something like sports, whether it's institutions, whatever it might be. That's fine, you can watch it. Okay, hang on, sorry, give me one sec. But so the idea of the significance is that you're going to basically say, all right, did the differences that happen result from the fact that we had like just random chance, random variation, or are they actually driven by something that's underlying it, right? So if the group that drank Gatorade performs better in the football combine, let's say, than the group that didn't, we want to know, like, from a probabilistic chance, right? Just this idea of natural variation and proportions. Did that group perform better because of the Gatorade? Or just because sometimes some groups do better than others, even if they were completely evenly matched, right? Sometimes one's going to do better and sometimes the other's going to do better just from natural variation. And if you don't believe me in this, you can try this with flipping a coin. You can take a coin, flip it 10 times. Now, if the coin is fair, how many heads would you expect to get? You would expect to get 5, right? 50-50 chance, I flipped it 10 times, I should get 5 heads and 5 tails. But if you're watching, go ahead and grab a coin, do this, and 75% of you are not going to get 5 heads. You're going to get 4 heads and 6 tails. And then a smaller group's going to get 3 heads and 7 tails. Does that mean that your coin's not fair? Not necessarily, because there's just some random variation that happens when we talk about flipping coins. So statistical significance is a way of testing against your data to say, like, is that difference, that variation that we're seeing, just due to random chance, or is it actually meaningful? Now, I would like to point out that significant doesn't necessarily mean substantial. So the difference can be small, but it's still statistically significant.
Yeah, so real quick, before we dive into that, do you need to step away, by the way?
I may need to go just change something really quick.
Yeah,
go ahead. You talk about what you're going to talk about, and I'll be right back.
So when we're talking about the statistical significance, right? So that term, statistically significance, means something. Basically, when you're doing the math of statistics, you run these tests on it, and there is a number that says, okay, this is statistically significant. And the point of that number is to say, hey, this isn't just random chance, right? But one of the things we're about to talk a little bit more about is the difference between it not being completely random, right? But being substantial, right? So that's one of the things that we'll dive into here in a second. But as she was talking about significance with the Gatorade, things like that, it's, okay, how is this correlated, right? Are these things connected? Are these things tied together? Or is it just because of random chance? And, in this case, we were talking about the Gatorade, and we were saying how, okay, are these people really performing differently because of the Gatorade? Or is it because of one of the many, many, many other factors that are at play? And as we've talked about on previous episodes as well, sometimes it's really hard to isolate that one variable. And so there's certain types of science that are just inherently not going to be as good at this. And we kind of talked about the other day is like, well, if you could lock a kid in a room for a while and then, just isolate those things. But then even that, it's like, well, you're not really just isolating those things because now that kid's responding to being locked in a room. So now you've confounded the whole thing. But to come back to the difference between significance and being substantially different, what would you say about that? What are the differences between that, Alexandra?
They're two different measurements, right? So significant is a statistical test that's telling you, is this more likely to be recognizing a real difference, Or is it most likely just chance variation? Whereas like a substantial measurement, the amount of difference has to do with actually what you're doing. And of course, substantial, as I talk with my kids all the time, they'll be like, is this thing big? And you're like, well, big is relative. Like they want it to be this absolute quantity of, I can say that, Makita's small and she's always small. But it's like, well, relative to what? She's big to a mouse, but she's small compared to the dog.
And
so significant is an absolute measurement, right? It is showing up as significantly different, meaning that it has less than a 5% chance, and we'll talk about that. It has less than a 5% chance that it's due to just randomness and that it's picking up some real difference. Whereas substantial has to do with what you're measuring, right? If we're talking about something that will help you, make 2% more muscle, well, that might not be that big of a difference. But if we're talking about something that gives you, I'm trying to think of something that, even though the actual quantity is small, it's a very meaningful difference.
Yeah.
So that's where you have to look at like what you're measuring in terms of, is that difference
You'll have to forgive me on this one, Alexandra, but it popped into my head, so of course I got to share it. Penis enlarging. It's like, oh, this is going to give you this much more, and it's like to some people it's like, oh, that's a big amount, and it's like that really matters, But you see in the studies and you see in the things like this, like and we've talked about this on the show before as well, but 5 times more likely, right? Or something like that. But the reality is when you get these wordings, when you get these catchphrases, when you get these headlines, you need to see what that really means. And okay, maybe it's 5 times more likely. Let's use men's hair loss, right? Okay, there are some drugs and whatever you can take to help minimize the chance, help you keep your hair, but there's really no magic pill, at least yet, that helps completely stop the thing. But let's say right now as a man, I have a 90% chance that I'll keep my full head of hair. Well, then they come out with this new drug and they say, oh, this is statistically significant that it's going to help me keep my hair. So let's go down this rabbit hole. And then what would the difference be if they could say this is going to substantially increase the chances of me keeping that hair?
Right. And so this is why, again, it also matters of like your starting point. So if you are 90% likely to keep your hair, they can't give you that much improvement on the likelihood of you're going to keep your hair. Now, if you were 10% likely to keep your hair and they're like, this is both significant and substantial, then maybe it means that it bumps you up to 50% likely. Right. And that could be a really meaningful difference for you to go from basically a 1 in 10 chance of keeping your hair to a 1 in 2 chance of keeping your hair. That could be really meaningful for you. But again, if you're terrified of losing your hair, that might not be good enough.
Yeah.
So that's what it's important to just keep in mind, that statistical test is a really hard cutoff. It is an absolute measure, although it is arbitrary. We've just decided 5%. As a scientific community, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right cutoff.
Right. Well, which is
selected.
Which is a really great point to say, because sorry to interrupt, but there's a lot of things in life where it's like, oh, well, that's how it is. That's the important thing. That's the number. But you can't forget, people decided these numbers at some point, and they're inherently going to be flawed because of that. And so in this case, 5% is what we said. Hey, above this is significant, below that is not. And that's what we've gone with as a community. And I'm sure in some cases it's a perfect number. It works great. And I'm sure in other cases, not so much. So don't forget, whether it's science or otherwise, like somebody came up with that thing at some point. That does not mean that is the absolute, the best, everything's perfect, right?
And there's a big problem with it even in science, which is that if we're saying, okay, we'll accept a 5% chance that this is still due to random chance, that means on average, 1 in 20 things that you find are actually still going to be just due to random chance, but you're going to think they're not.
Yeah.
And so this is really important when we start talking about lots and lots of studies that happen out there, which is that a substantial proportion of them, and this is where we're going to go to like a meaningful proportion of these studies, aren't actually representing something that is a reflection of the real difference, right? They find something that's cool. They go, oh, wow. So a great example was actually the judge, right? This idea that judges are more likely to grant parole after lunch than before. That was an example of a study that they were unable to repeat because probably the original study was one of those 1 in 20, right? So the study was done well. There wasn't any methodological flaw to it. And they looked at 2 groups of judges and they looked at like before them, them eating before lunch and after eating lunch and what their parole rates were. But there's also just natural variation in how judges are going to give parole or not. And while the test came up, said, well, there's a less than 5% chance that this is due to just randomness, it probably was in the end due to some random variations or maybe something else. But regardless, when they tried to repeat that study and see that same finding, they didn't have it. And so this is a really important thing to understand with science, is even when we do everything right, because there's just a lot of chaos and randomness in our world. It is not a simple, this always leads to this, which always leads to this. We have a complex world that we live in that sometimes, despite our best intentions, studies are going to come up to be wrong ultimately, right? New information will come out that shows that they're wrong. And so as a layperson looking at this, you have to understand, rather than being like, well, science is just useless then because they all messed it up the first time, this is a natural part of science. And there's not really a way to get around it in a complex world. Some of the stuff we find is ultimately going to be wrong. So we have to approach it with some forgiveness, right? Some understanding and patience that there's going to be self-corrections, and appreciate the fact that science does self-correct and that new research is going to come out that's going to help refine what our understanding was before. But the other part that we also really need to push for is repeated findings.
Replicability,
right?
yeah.
So, right, as a consumer of science, we really need to be supporters of this idea that I don't want to just see this once. I need to see it happen again and again. I need to see it happen in a different situation. If great, the pilot worked, before we make this permanent national policy, I want to see another pilot that works, or I want to see a scaled up pilot that works, or I want to see it work in a different city. So really, really saying that we want that repeatability, and then having some grace and understanding when the new test comes out and it didn't repeat the findings, not just chucking everything out and being like, well, then we're not going to work with science, but understanding that that is how science progresses.
Yeah, and that's one of the really important points here, which is to recognize that although science as an institution does a better job of controlling the variables and controlling the situation and trying to look at just one slice and do a controlled test, science itself cannot be perfect. There's still going to be errors. There's still going to be a chance that something is wrong. Even if someone's doing everything right, it got peer reviewed, made it through all that stuff, the science was sound, there's still just a percentage chance that it could be wrong, or there's something that could be completely random. And another example to take it away from science is just to compare it to what would the opposite be, right? And I was watching a silly rom-com last night, and they're like, oh, you should never be honest with the guy, never tell them anything, don't let them know how you're really feeling. And of course in the movie one thing happens and the person's secrets get shared, and you're like, oh, of course you shouldn't have told the guy. And it's like, okay, well, that's like a one-time thing that happened to that one person. Without science, that type of thing then gets replicated as a rule for everyone everywhere, right? With science, you do that same thing, except you do it with thousands of people, and then you come out and you say, hey, the studies show, the data suggests that you should be honest with them, and then it can go broader, and life happens, years pass, sometimes decades pass, and then maybe there's a correction sometime in the future, says, oh, actually, you know what, we were wrong, or actually we were right back then, but now a lot of factors have changed, we've done new studies, we found out that's different. Or sometimes this is another just reality of the world. A lot of times studies are constrained to a certain geographical area. Now, that type of thing I hope and think is kind of improving as time goes on, right? But for example, one thing I heard the other day, a lot of the psychological studies are done in the US, and that can lead to, that doesn't really apply to those people in Australia or India or Africa. It's just life is just so different. Psychology is literally different. So being able to replicate those things, and also potentially being able to replicate those things in different populations, can be a very important thing. Now, Alexandra, I'm going to let you jump off whenever you need to go, because I know you got the kids. Is that now?
Yeah, I got 1 minute, and then the next show is going to end.
All right, perfect. So with this 1 minute, I guess the last thing I want to talk about is just the business aspect of things. So give us a couple of thoughts on, how these studies happen, why the science is occurring, and what issues can come up with businesses and things like that, and then I can take it from there.
Yeah, so the biggest flaw here, right, is that the journals that publish data, that publish science, are businesses, right? They have to stay in business. And so therefore they need people to be reading their journals, and they need to keep their prestige of releasing really exciting stuff. And so one of the things that this leads to is that it's much less likely that you're going to get a study published if you don't have an exciting finding. So imagine doing the judge study, right? And you go and you look at how judges do parole, and you find out that when you eat lunch has no impact on when you issue parole. Journals are very unlikely to accept that paper because you're like, well, it doesn't have an impact. Like, that's not all that interesting. But let's say you do the study 10 times, and on the 10th time, you then find a result. Well, you're much more likely to get that 10th study published. And even if you didn't do it 10 times, let's say 10 groups, different groups, totally innocently, each one does the study independently. And they don't necessarily know that the other ones are doing it. And then one of the 10 groups finds that positive result. The 9 negative papers aren't getting published, and the 10th positive paper is. So there's this problem where we, again, sort of selectively raise up the ones that have the interesting findings. And so that 1 in 20 chance actually ends up getting increased a little bit in terms of what we see, because we're going to take that 5% of ones that just randomly showed up cool, and we're more likely to publish them. So this is also something we have to be a little bit careful of. When you see a really cool finding, again, unless you see it replicated, kind of be like, that's neat, let's see if it shows up again. Because those initial studies that show some cool finding are more likely than 5% to actually be just random chance, because of our need, one, for like the universities to keep publishing things. So they're driven to be able to find good things, but then also the journals to want to have things that are cool to share. And this doesn't mean that they're falsifying data. It doesn't mean that they're like making stuff up. It just leads us to sometimes raise up things that are due to random chance, but we just don't know it yet. So one of the things that I would say again is, like, as a layperson, if we can be more supportive of scientific research that shows things in negative, we're going to be better off, right, as a society and as scientific progress, in being able to understand the fact that, you know, sometimes these findings aren't actually interesting, but that's still really important from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, and you know, just barely scratching the surface on that one. But the reality is money still needs to happen. And also, by the way, there are other factors as well, as like, hey, there's people going through these universities trying to learn how to do this thing, and they're doing this process. So they need projects to work on too. And then there's just, hey, guess what? Some person that's high up in the scientific world or the university world, they just have a pet project that they want to see, and they have, maybe they have donors, maybe they have people who are trying to do that. There's all these human factors that come into play as well. So I'm going to let you go, Alexandra. Tell the kids we said hello. Oh, no worries. You know, it's not a statistically significant problem yet, or substantial. So we'll tolerate it this time. All right. Talk to you later. Have a great rest of your day. So, you know, of course, every time we talk with Alexandra, we could keep going, you know, forever probably. She's love having her on. Such a smart lady, and gives us so much knowledge both around science and data and things much more than that as well. So when we're talking about some of the unseen things and unseen reasons why something may get published or not published, she was pointing out how sometimes it's just, okay, the original findings weren't as exciting. So I wanted to make sure to point out, like, don't forget, the word news is about something being different, about something being exciting. And so because of that, like, just think about everything in a headline, right? There's a reason these things get sensationalized. There's a reason that the news media has gone to getting everyone up in arms and emotional and things like that, because that leads to people getting more engaged, that leads to people reading things, that leads to people clicking on things, which leads to people buying things. And if all those things are happening, that means money is flowing, which means that actually ends up rewarding the people who did the research, right? They get attention, they get some press, they get those types of things, which can be good for the institution, right? And hopefully the science and stuff they're doing is the things that matter. But that's not always true. Again, as humans are involved, and then especially when you have humans, and then you add money, and then you add power, and then you add reputation, like, it is asking for some issues to exist in some way. But that's the beauty of the institution of science and the peer review process, is that helps minimize all of those issues. Now, the important thing to know, it does not make them perfect, right? Because in reality, nothing's perfect besides me. And so you just got to keep that in mind. And the beauty of the Institute of Science is that it just minimizes all of those bad things. It minimizes the chance of something being reported as, hey, this is fact, this is true, when it really is just chance. So those are some of the reasons why, trust science. Don't, yes, have doubt. As Alexandra was saying earlier, there are going to be some things that you should question a little bit more, and maybe you should have some red flags that start to go off when you're like, oh, okay, I heard that, but that headline and that article is very strongly worded. Let me go check another source, see how some other people are looking at it. Oh, then maybe let me go look at the original source and say, hey, what is that study actually saying? And then you go and look and you find out that the information, it says, oh, data suggests, and oh yes, it is significant, but it's still a really small number. Things like that can help you kind of see through the BS, see through the marketing part of it all, and get to the truth. And then another one is that replicability that we were talking about, the repeatability, the fact that, hey, this study has now been repeated and done other times, other places, other people, and these things are still found to be true. So, of course, as we're talking about statistics and chance and how likely something is to be true or wrong or just up to random chance, I can't help but think about Dungeons and Dragons, because Dungeons and Dragons has a very important part of that game is about dice rolling and probability. And the most popular dice in the game, used all the time, is called a D20. It's a dice that has 20 sides. And one of the fun things about it is when you roll the dice, if it's 20 sides, you got 100% probability. That means you can just divide 100 by 20. That means there's a 5% chance that any one number is going to come up. 1's going to come up 5% of the time, 20 is going to come up 5% of the time, 12 is going to come up 5% of the time, and so on. The dice don't lie. The dice, of course, it's possible, especially if it's a physical die. Maybe it gets dirty, maybe there's some chips in it, things like that leads to that probability changing a little bit. But the reality is it's not going to change that drastically unless it's intentionally modified or something like that. Now, that being said, there's a fun set of videos that is done by a YouTuber named Z Bashu. And I don't know that he had a playlist for it, unfortunately, but I'll share at least one of the videos so you guys can find a little bit more about it in case you like to hear about D&D stuff and you want to see some of these dice things. But he's talking about how everyone's lying about dice and how you can choose dice that are luckier than others, and you can do certain things to train your dice and things like that. And so if you're into D&D, it's definitely funny. If you're not into D&D, maybe not your bag, but you guys can check that out if you're interested. All right, so that's about probability. That's about science and whether or not we should trust it as an institution, some of the things that could go wrong with it. And you know what? I think today we're just going to keep it at that. I think we're going to keep today as a little bit of a shorter episode. We've got a lot of exciting things that we're working on this week, and as we've got our Kickstart Your Kitchen cohort coming up next week, we have our first full-time hire who's coming to work for us. Their last day is on Friday, so that'll be really exciting as we move into this new chapter of Helpful for Life. Tomorrow will be episode 90. Man, for those of you who are like, oh, I just can't do anything, there's nothing, I'm not getting anything done in the world, what's the point of trying, all those types of things. Well, look, it was just a couple months ago we decided to start this show, and here we are now, and it's already been 90 episodes, and actually already has been 90 because we had episode 0. It's a computer nerd type of thing, but start counting at 0 instead of 1. So yeah, we've had 90 episodes. We're almost the way to 100 episodes. And, of course, if you guys have been here along this journey, you've seen changes, you've seen ups, you've seen downs, you've seen some great discussions, you've seen some that maybe fell a little more flat. But one thing that I think you for sure can have is at least an occasional smile, hopefully an occasional laugh. And if you're thinking, then that's a win in my book, because one of the main things we're trying to do with the show is to get you guys to think and to talk about things that you wouldn't otherwise, or you haven't otherwise, or maybe you've never even thought about before. And the more we can get you guys thinking and talking and sharing with others, I think the better we'll all be. I mean, things like this, like the more people understand the science, the more intelligent people, or the more intelligent conversations you can have with your friends and your family. And around the dinner table, when someone starts spouting off something like crazy and way out in left field, like you can just kind of talk to them or the group and say, hey, actually, like, hey, have you seen the studies on that? Have they been replicated? Like, is that substantial, or is that just statistically significant? Like, have you looked into these things? Because the reality is, a lot of times people do not. And I say a lot of times, probably most of the times, unless you run in certain circles where people do that all the time. I would say the average person is just grabbing those headlines and reading those articles and seeing those videos and then taking what they want and then going and spouting it out. So anything we can do to help you guys be a little bit more critical and start to think a little bit more for yourself and understand why and how these things come into the world and how you can help better know what they mean and share them and discuss them with other people. That's one of the things that we're trying to do here. So that brings me to our challenge for today. And for today, we're talking about science, what could go wrong. By the way, I want to hear from you guys. If any of you guys did a science experiment, that was our challenge for last week around science. So I want to hear what you guys did, if anything, and tell me what you found and was it surprising, and hey, maybe even write it up as a little bit of a headline. Maybe intentionally try and blow up your findings to make it more interesting and see if we can see through to the truth. But for today, let's think here. I like this idea of replicability. I want you to think about some sort of fact or scientific study or whatever that you've heard about at some point, and I want you to just look into it a little bit. Be like, hey, I heard that chocolate makes you live longer, or hey, coffee, it really leads to all these positive benefits, or maybe it's like, if you have sex 3 times a week, then you'll end up getting bigger muscles, or whatever it may be. Think about some little tidbit that you've heard in the news, you heard somebody say, maybe you read it yourself, and just go to look into it a little bit and see, okay, where is the source material from that thing? What was that study, and how was it done, and did other people do that type of thing? And this is maybe it's up to you, like how far you dig into it, right? But I guess one of the main things I would encourage you guys to do is look past the secondary sources and meaning like the news outlets and things like that, because just because you see one thing repeated on a whole bunch of news sites, a lot of times they've just grabbed the one thing that one news site said and maybe shifted the words a little bit and just kind of redid it. But when you go and look at the actual original source material, then you can start to see for yourself, like, all right, what did the study really say? And then, by the way, are there references to other studies? You could even just grab that study name and put in a search engine and say, has this been replicated? Are there other studies like this? So, yeah. And of course, for those who are doing studies of their own, who maybe they did one last week, and maybe you could go and try and replicate that thing now and go and do that same test, but maybe in a different situation, maybe with some maybe in the same exact situation, maybe with a larger sample size. Maybe at first you say you were doing our orange juice test. Well, first you just kind of poured a couple glasses, but maybe you need to try with different glasses, and maybe you need to try a different temperature. Maybe you need to try different brands of orange juice, or maybe you just need to have the same thing, but make sure to test it 5 times instead of just one, so you have better data that you can work off of, and you can and potentially pull some more significant results out of it. So there's a little bit of a challenge for you guys around science and trying to see how it could go wrong. And if you want a little more easy, lighthearted challenge, go look at the background for where some of the science came from, and you can see like, there's a study that said that, red meat's actually not that bad for you, and there's no problems with it at all, and you should totally eat, a pound of it every day or whatnot. Well, go look and see where did that come from, and then maybe you'll find that, oh, this is done by this organization, and it's like, oh, well, what's that organization? Oh, actually, that's funded by a group of meat producers. And as Alexandra has pointed out on a previous episode, there are industry groups that can and do science that is good and is sound. But of course, sometimes when the money is that close, it's worth looking a little bit extra, looking a little bit closer. So yeah, so there's a couple challenges for you guys today. And with that, happy hump day.